race, because you have all these lifters that are just constantly falling forward in space because their lumbar erectors, their thoracic erectors, their like TL junction is just so on that like the stack just instantly kind of helps them feel their abs, feel their hamstrings. And all of a sudden they could move without hurting themselves. He gave them kind of like movement options, I suppose the term is. So you can imagine the stack as kind of being like a man in the crossroads in that photo there. It's like, if you're in that stacked like joint neutrality position, you can kind of go anywhere. You've got like the ability to kind of move anywhere theoretically because you're in that starting center point. You can move into extension, you can move into flexion, all those kind of things. So for some lifters that don't really lean into the extremes of like certain techniques, the stack might be all you need to do. So the stack works quite well for Gen Pops a lot of the time, because like Gen Pops, you might not be teaching them a really, really, really high bench arch. So you don't really have to worry about like giving them the ability to really externally rotate and flare. And you might not be teaching them like a super duper like leveraged deadlift position. You might just be trap barring them or something. So the stack works really well in that regard. But the stack might not necessarily be the best thing for every lifter. So sometimes over relying on a stack can also contribute to those bones being stuck. So if you're one of those lifters that naturally lent into an extension pattern for so long, and then the stack came around and that kind of like saved you in a sense, it gave you back those movement patterns. It's very easy to hang on to that stack. Like it's very easy to kind of over cue the stack in a lot of times because it's kind of what made you feel good initially. And like part of the reason why like the stack felt good is because it did decrease all that extension tone that you were kind of being pushed into. But once again, it's like the stack might not be enough to kind of help you get into those like perfect positions for your lifting that can add extra kilos on the bar. So for some lifters, stacking might be really useful for like, so for squatting, stacking can be pretty useful in teaching that lifter how to go straight up and down. They don't really have that kind of excessive sort of center of mass shift forward. But for another lifter that's already quite stacked, you might need to get them to turn on their erectors more, kind of get them to think about trying to sort of like flare their ribs a little bit, push their rib cage back, get a bit more spinal curves happening so they can then actually leverage themselves properly for a conventional deadlift. Yeah. And it all just kind of comes down to that individualization of lifter, what the lifter needs to do, like how extreme the position they need to be because of the weight they're trying to lift or like the efficiency they're trying to go for, and what's going to be the best way of doing it. So you might need to not cue them into a stack so much potentially. You might need to, I suppose, that where you come into as a coach or a lifter, it's whether you want to do that.
Yeah, the stack's a fantastic starting point for anyone, but as you start to get more individualized and you're trying to like get every single kilo out of that program or on the platform, and you really want to try and take your lifting to the next level, which is why we're running this course. This is where the answers lie. Okay, being able to specify and know about the lifter in front of you, how they move, if this is the stack going to be beneficial for them, being able to just be more dynamic, as we were saying earlier in the presentation. This is really where the money is, and it's really helpful.
So I thought it'd be like just kind of important, or just kind of cool to briefly touch on where a lot of stacking stuff came from. So everyone's probably heard of PRI, Postural Restoration Institute. They kind of popularized a lot of the 90-90 position, like the 90-90 breathing. Probably seen them lying on their backs, breathing into a balloon. They kind of become a punching bag a little bit lately as well. Like a lot of people have been hating on the breathing side of stuff. Like it's got a time and a place. But the important thing to remember about PRI is that it really kind of arose from just kind of undertrained elderly population that were in a bit of pain, had like niggles and aches and stuff, and some low level training that PRI just kind of came up with, where they were really focusing on kind of restoring that stack, or the zone of apposition as they call it, made them feel better. Because a lot of the time they were just leaning too much into extension and like their lower backs felt tight, or they couldn't lift their shoulders above their head or something like that. So then as a result, powerlifting kind of then went, we can fix everything by breathing. So they kind of lent too much into the breathing side of things. Because the thing that you have to remember, the difference between an elderly untrained and a powerlifter is that a powerlifter got the way they are by being pushed there by weight. Like their body adapted to that shape to survive the barbell, essentially. So breathing drills may not be the most effective kind of method for a power lifter, especially at trying to get them better at SBD, it can be great at making them feel a bit better. If they've got some like immediate acute kind of pains, they can get a really good result there. I've seen that happen a lot. But it's not the best at creating like long lasting effects, because if weight got you there, weight has to get you out of there. So it's more so interesting to understand sort of the PRI side of things and where they came from, but whether or not to use them is kind of at your own discretion. So what this photo does show quite well though is kind of just like the difference in like where kind of like the breathing force does go through. So if you look at the middle there, like when you've got the two diaphragms stacked, so you've got like the thoracic diaphragm, the pelvic diaphragm stacked, everything just kind of moves up and down. Like you've got, that's where your force vectors are going. Like they're pretty well just kind of like directed up and down. Whereas like with a lot of excessive rib flare, you can see that blue arrow, it starts to kind of push you forward. That's where the force vectors kind of go. So it starts to become more sort of like slanted up and down there. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the demands of those lifts. So if you're doing a squat or like a sumo deadlift, perhaps a stack might be a little bit better because you've got those internal forces moving you straight up and down. Whereas like for bench or deadlifts, depending on your technique, maybe having a bit more rib flare might be better because it changes how those internal forces kind of move. And that's essentially just sort of what happens here. It's like very briefly, I'm just like what happens with breathing is like when you inhale, like a combination of the diaphragms and whether you use other kind of musculature to do it, like the diaphragms will descend on each other. And it kind of just creates space for like the lungs to inflate with more air. Like you get that vacuum, which makes the lungs actually inflate, but it creates a bit of space. So what happens is like the diaphragm moves down, then like everything kind of has to move down through the guts. The organs have to move down as well to create space. So the pelvic floor will kind of just like go as well. And then what generally happens is like, whether you kind of naturally exhale or you force the exhale with the abdominals, then everything just kind of like relaxes or contracts to push straight back up. So in a sense, like breathe in, everything kind of comes down, breathe out, everything kind of comes back up. And that's sort of where that breathe in, breathe out cue came from with squatting if you didn't really train much powerlifting. So like, I know that a lot of gen pops are often taught to breathe in on the way down with a squat and breathe out on the way up with a squat. Or if you've ever been stuck on a lift, like in a squat kind of around the 90 degrees or a little bit higher, you need something to get past that sticking point. And a big exhale is something I know a few lifters lean into. Part of the reason for that is because you get those internal force vectors from the actual fluid shift to the air to push you up. It's not super powerful, but sometimes it can be enough to just kind of tip the scales your way in the sense of like whether or not that barbell crushes you, whether or not you can get past your sticking point and kind of complete the lift. So once again, it's kind of like interesting, like if this is something we can lean into more and more just to make sticking points like a thing of the past and just make someone stronger and stronger getting through those difficult parts of the lift. And that's essentially the way that you can think of with breathing is like, in a sense, like the way that your skeleton is stacked or like how you breathe, or whether you use your diaphragm, whether you use like rib cage for the breathe, it's essentially just like, that's the way that you move for 22,000 breaths a day. So if you're one of those lifters that has no idea how to like stack your pelvis and rib cage and the stack saved your life, potentially it's never really carried over because like you're doing it with lifting, but then at the same time, like you're not really allowing that kind of force to move up and down through the diaphragms. It's still kind of pushing you forward a little bit because there's maybe one or two exercises or cues you could do, which would make you a little bit better at that. So it's an interesting way of thinking about how force of the body moves. So you're thinking about that fluid shift kind of scenario, moves down and it moves up. So guts is a cool thing to talk about here as well, because I mean, between the diaphragms, between the pelvis and the rib cage, you've got guts. You've got like all this stuff in the middle of your stomach that's kind of got to go somewhere. And it's got some weight to it. Like it's got some considerable kind of mass to it. So like if you look at Big Z here, when he was at his largest, like, and most
sure
strongmen,
is that Dream World, mate. Sure.
Yeah, I just noticed that. But like when he's at his largest, and most strongmen, like they all kind of present like this. They all have this like really large rib cage, just kind of like traps up to your ears kind of scenario. This belly, kind of like the power belly that protrudes out in front. Obviously, it's got a function because you can like rest an axle or a log or something on the stomach mid clean. But also as well, that's how they present because of their sport. Because the thing about strongman is like you kind of do everything. There's a lot of movement variability in strongman, but the sport goes forward a lot. There's a lot of carrying in it. And like even though you're carrying stuff at the front, like your lower back often turns into this big kind of powerhouse, or your mid back turns into this big kind of powerhouse that pushes you forward. So if you imagine all that musculature, like those thick erectors on the back of your body, the back of your spine, like contracting and compressing you and pushing you forwards, it's going to push your guts forwards as well. So you're going to have like these, like this, I suppose, this fluid shift or like this mass kind of pushing the stomach forward, pushing out against the stomach forward, and kind of then just like orienting someone's center of mass here. So as you can kind of see, like he looks like he's kind of leaning forward over the front of his knees there. And therefore he has to kind of lean his upper body backwards to kind of counteract it. So it looks like his stomach kind of protrudes over in front. So it's another force vector you can take into account alongside, because if you have like, I suppose this is where you can kind of think about like the super heavies I was talking about. Like the super heavies that are good at squatting are so well balanced that like they don't have this kind of excessive pushing forward. There's a lot of strongmen like don't particularly like squatting. Part of the reason why like strongmen often would get attracted to strongmen is because there's no squatting. And sometimes it's because they already kind of present like this, but either way, the sport kind of pushes them there anyway. So this is just an example of what it looks like, but guts can really take a play into how someone is stuck in their movement patterns. Anything you want to add to that?
I think it takes a very particular type of program to program for someone who presents with this sort of posture. And that's what we'll eventually dive into with just looking at different patterns of lifters, whether you're flex biased or extended bias, either also. Cool. There was a question up a little bit higher from Sonia.